Okay, we're about to start letter 15, and the goal of this letter is to somewhat help us to understand the concept called the spheres. Now, one of the gifts that Hasidus brings to the world is it gives us tangible usage for ideas that are often very esoteric and difficult to comprehend. And so that's not the only goal of Hasidus, but it's one of the gifts. Now, all along, there is what I like to refer to as the wink, wink. We think we understand, but what we're understanding is really only our capacity to incorporate these ideas in our mind. We're living through it now in the parshas where we have a lot of human terminology describing Hashem's arm and Hashem's hand and Hashem said and Hashem thought and Hashem changed his heart and so on, which again are opportunities for us through this terminology that we're describing, essentially infinite ideas, to have some workability with it. Now, this is predicated on again, the permission that Torah gives us on a fundamental philosophical idea, which is Hashem is infinite. That's sort of, pardon the pun, there's no most basic definition of Hashem is that he cannot be defined. And therefore, we must also say that Hashem is not only able to be expressed in the infinite, because if we were to say that Hashem cannot express himself in the finite, then we would be putting a limitation on Hashem. I know it feels like one of those word puzzles, but essentially this is the idea. Hashem's infinity can, must, may also penetrate something of the finite. And this is really one of the goals of Hasidus overall. Hopefully we say it about every chapter of Tanya, but this is the whole message that unfortunately Hashem was so big, he was irrelevant. It's like talking about galaxies upon galaxies, or to tell somebody there's 1,000 things wrong with your essay. It's not, you can't even start. So Hashem was made so infinite that he was made irrelevant. So Hasidus came along and made Hashem much more accessible. Now, again, as we've talked about, this was not always so comfortable for a lot of people because they felt that it was a little too comfortable, a little too close, a little too much like we're talking about Hashem, like he's a member of the community. And yet, again, we constantly come back to this idea that the infinity of Hashem, again, I know it sounds like a funny way, by definition, Hashem's infinity must also be within the finite. And right, it's oxymoronic and it doesn't fit into raw, rigid rules of logic. And that's our problem, that we are so fixated on, well, that doesn't make sense, as if therefore I should dismiss it. And again, we know that there are things that are higher than simply what makes sense. And this is the message of the yarmulke. There's something higher than us. There's something higher than intelligence. And it's very frustrating for people because, well, which one is it? Is it up or down, black or white, in or out? And as we just know from our own life experience, nothing really of value in life is like that. So the spheros, which are introduced in the Zohar, and you may recognize, you'll definitely recognize the ideas of the spheros because we talk about them so much. Their original source is in the Pasach Eliyahu that we say on Friday, on Erev Shabbos, as part of the davening, where we talk about how Hashem has set up a 10 identifiable system, 3 of the intellect and 7 of the character. Now, that is a helpful factual. But again, the question becomes, what is its takeaway for us? What are we supposed to do about that? So an analogy. Everybody intuitively knows that if you let go of your pencil, it falls down. So the scientists came along and say that that's gravity. So we say, what's gravity? Gravity means that if you let go of your pencil, it falls down. But we ask, okay, so we know that if I let go of my pencil, it falls down. Why am I better off by knowing that that's gravity? So we say, no. Because once you understand gravity, then you can start to work to have airplanes that seem to defy gravity. Meaning we're not simply putting a name on a concept that everybody is immediately intuitively aware of. Like if you let go of your pencil, it falls down. But now you can give it a sophisticated term. Now, by giving it a term, we start to understand it, at least to the point that we can work with it. It's irrelevant whether I believe in gravity or I don't believe in gravity. or I understand all of the parameters of gravity. But once I have a term and once I have some, I'll call it some science behind it, I now can work with it. Well, the same thing is going to be true with the spheres. Many of these we intuit. And like so many things, they're not rigid silos that operate in complete independence of each other. A person is not only chesed. Even when we talk about, for example, the models of Avram being chesed and Yitzchak being gevura, of course, it doesn't mean that Avram is only chesed. It means this was his most natural, most primary of character traits, and Yitzchak gevura, etc. And each one of us at our own level having our particular strength where we are the most profoundly comfortable, focused, strong, etc. So the process of the spheroids, rather than seeing it as rigid, independent entities, it's more like a spectrum that goes across from one dark color to a light color in gradual, almost smooth interaction. And a core sign of the spheroids being utilized for holiness, because reminder, spheroids are amoral, not immoral. They're tools, and it depends how they're used, because Abraham was chesed that offered kindness, and Yishmael was distorted chesed that was lust and crass indulgence. Yitzchak was gevura that was self-restraint, and Esav was gevura that's just being mean and the bully. So the spheroids, if they are being utilized in holiness, they are cooperative. A surefire sign of holiness is cooperation. The soil nurtures the grass nurtures the animal nurtures the person nurtures Hashem and the world, and it goes in a healthy, combined, cooperative manner. And a surefire sign of unholiness is I do what I do, and I don't do that. And I'm chesed, and when it comes to gevura, I don't do gevura. Like sand, where nothing will grow because the sand will not share its nutrients with any vegetation. So we are going to be in the goal of this letter, as the opening line says, lahavin, to understand, not just to list it out. So again, we're not just looking to list out all the state capitals, which is a form of data, but we want to have a real personal, nuanced understanding, again, like my analogy with gravity, so that we can have some form of useful application of these terms, mashal umelitza. Now, this quote, and this is a common thing in Jewish scholarship, rather than just simply make a statement, it's nice to incorporate a quote from somewhere. This comes from the book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 6. King Solomon writes, Lahavin mashal umelitza. Now, the words mashal and melitza, we're familiar with those. We see them commonly. A mashal we often use as an analogy, and a melitza is also a form of expression, like the difference between an analogy, a metaphor, a simile, a parable, and so on. So the word mashal is significant here, not simply because it's a quote from the book of Proverbs. The word mashal, although we always translate it simply as an analogy, actually comes from the word moishel. Moishel is to dominate. In fact, it may even be the origin of the word a marshal. I'm not sure about that, but there is such a suggestion. What is the function of dominance? It means there's something I don't understand. I give you a mashal. Now I can not dominate it in an aggressive manner, but now I can have some use for it. Now I have some control of it. I am able to be moshel it. And the melitza, which is again a form of understanding that allows me to have some grasp in a manner that's not just almost like an accident. You know, the old broken clock is right twice a day. The melitza means that the idea stands on its own. It's not, so again, an analogy, a parable that we're all familiar with. You know, the tortoise and the hare is a parable. It's not a real story. It's a way to help us understand the value of determination. That's the tortoise and the hare. But there is no real value to the story of the tortoise and the hare or the boy who cried wolf until you get to the lesson. And once you get to the lesson, you can discard the parable. I mean, once you understand that not to create false alarms and panic, or you understand the virtue of deliberate small steps, you no longer need to have the mushal. A melitza is something that has value in and of itself. And here's where we run into this very delicate issue when we're talking about the spheres, meaning it's not just a linguistic distinction. The value of the spheres is our capacity to understand how Hashem operates through the spheres so that we can, in turn, operate through those spheres. We might, therefore, suspect that once we've mastered this idea that Hashem is truly infinite, the spheres are seen then as just like training wheels. It's a way for us to begin the discussion, but eventually we'll outgrow the need for that analogy, like we outgrew the need for the boy who cried wolf analogy. We simply understand the danger of panicking and misreporting and so on, and thus we discard this analogy. That is one mechanism through which we do this. Another mechanism is that the spheros, or the lesson, retains its significance and meaning even after we've mastered the essential core message that it's trying to communicate. And this is an example that we're familiar with. There is the argument that is made, it's not a Torah argument, but it's at least suggested in Torah, that mitzvahs are really just busy work. That since we have a natural tendency to indulge ourselves in just our impulses, I see it, I want it, I do it. So therefore, Hashem came and gave us the mitzvahs. When Mashiach will come, so we will have mastered our impulses. We'll be totally aligned with godliness. We'll see godliness everywhere. So the mitzvahs will ultimately become annulled, because the mitzvahs, from this perspective, were really only a mechanism through which we could sensitize ourselves to godliness. But once we have completely mastered that is both personally as well as globally, and now godliness is massively evident. So now it's like learning how to use a compass or a map. We now have GPS, so we don't need to know how to read maps. We now have a furnace. We don't need to know how to start a fire. We now have butcher shops. We don't need to learn how to hunt, and so on. So we've outgrown the necessity, this argument goes, of mitzvahs, because we haven't innately become spiritually sensitized. That is one argument. Then the counter argument to that is that the mitzvahs are of value in themselves. Yes, they also give us insight into the infinity of Hashem, and they sensitize us to the spiritual rather than the animalistic impulsive. But still, they retain, and that's this term melitza, they retain their significance even once we have, I don't want to say outgrown is not the right word, but once we have mastered the subtext message that they have brought to us. So we don't have to learn how to do long division because we all have a calculator. We don't need to memorize the state capitals because we all have Google and so on. So, right, so certain practices we outgrow. We no longer need to do them because they were never innately valuable. They were simply a method to understanding something else. In contrast, what we're saying here is that there is a significance that goes way beyond. Oh, I'm sorry. Sort of the opposite almost. There's a significance that is innate to the mechanism, to the spheros, in addition to it being an insight into the infinity of Hashem. So I'm going to put the handout on the screen here. People printed it out already, but it might be a little easier. So again, we talked about the spectrum, the spheroids generally. Again, these are things that everyone here is familiar with, I'm assuming. So we'll just sort of refresh, put it in the fore of our mind, because we're going to come across a lot of these vocabulary words. So it'll probably be easier if we can sort of cover them here and not have to constantly, click here for more information and go back to the reference. So the spheroids are generally subdivided into the intellectual, Chabad, and the character, the 7 of the midas. You recognize those. We say it in the davening every day. L'cha Hashem ha'kedula v'ha'gevura and so on. We list out the 6, and then the 7th, which is Malchus, which is the implementation. We spoke about it in Shul actually yesterday. So then we talk about also another vocabulary term, the 5 levels of the soul. We use the word neshama rather generically, but again, one of the gifts of Hasidus is it gives us immanence and personal value to the ideas. So the 5 levels of the soul: nefesh, basic existence. Even a rock has nefesh. The fact that it exists announces that God exists. Ruach, emotional, spirit. Even an animal can be playful or angry or sad. Neshama, which is the distinctive characteristic of human beings. God blew the nishmas chayim, the breath of life, which is the distinctive capacity for the intellect. And again, not just conditioning, because an animal can also learn how to do something. Beavers build dams and birds build beautiful nests and so on. But this is about imagination and the capacity to get beyond my limited sense of self. These are very personalized. They directly affect my humanity and are affected by my humanity. Then there is the 2 characteristics that are makif. They surround, like culture. They influence, even if I can't put a definitive handle on them. They are chaya, what we live for. And ultimately, yichida, that is the innate connection, like a parent has with a child. You're innately connected with that child, not because you learn something about it, not because they're going to bring you something or give you some tangible benefit. It simply is that way. Science tries to tell us, well, it has to do with enzymes in the brain or Cro-Magnon man. And we know that it's simply that innate connection. And we make the argument that it's the innate connection that we have with Hashem. It's been the Tanya of the last few days. It's today's Hayom Yom. We are instinctively connected to Hashem, not because we learned it, not because we went to Hebrew school, not because we like it, and so on. Then we're going to also revisit the 4 worlds or 4 stages of awareness. Remember, the word we use is worlds, but don't confuse that. It's not a planet. It's not a locale. It's a stage of awareness. The word olam, meaning a world, but also means hidden or how aware we are of it. Atzilus, as the word Eitzel means, it is next to Hashem. So it does have its own identity, but its identity is consumed with Hashem. Bria means I create, it's created. If it's created, there's got to be a creator. And again, it also announces Hashem. Yetzira is more like the word for art. It's more particularized, so it's more about the art, but if there's art, there's got to be an artist. And then Asiya, which is the world that we naturally inhabit, where our immediate awareness is, I am busy. This is what I am doing. And then we hope to get over ourselves and at least have an awareness that we are art that Hashem has, is the artist thereof. A couple of other phrases. We could use the word zun, which is a combo. It's a shorthand of the short face, zeir anpin. That's the z part. Short meaning it's non-expressive. These are what we call the 6 personal midos. So I'm a nice person, even though I'm not doing something nice at this exact moment. Or I'm an organized person, even if right now I'm not balancing my checkbook, etc. And then the feminine takes this characteristic and nukva, that's the end sound of zun, is za and nukva, that's where you get the acronym, is the malchus, where I take all of that stuff, it becomes developed, cogitated upon, thought about, contemplated, and ultimately this is the decision. Malchus is the decision. We have kalim, vessels, again, another idea that we're familiar with. The idea that it's an identifiable holder of the godly characteristic. So it's the illustration. Sometimes the godliness is way more than the kalim can contain. Like I get confused. It's the first day of Talmud or Lahavdil trigonometry or French, and I walk in and I'm just completely overwhelmed. Or the first day of learning how to drive or some other skill, and I feel completely smothered like a flood of information and so forth. We're going to talk about the four basic elements. Again, these are all terms that we have mentioned before. Earth, which is associated conceptually with being both stable, like we even say grounded, but also can be like immovable, uncooperative. Wind, which can move the earth, but it also is non-substantive. It's sort of empty. Fire, which can be passion. It can also be anger. Water, which is the source of all life. Nothing can live without water, but it also includes indulgence and so on. And again, we talk about he, the infinite, Ein Sof light, and his Kalim are one in Atzilus. So in Atzilus, when you see godliness, you see God. We touch that from time to time, hopefully, if we develop that kind of sensitivity. When I see a mezuzah or a Torah scroll or an act of inspired kindness, somebody's neshama coming to life, I see God itself. I see Hashem. What else could drive this person to do something of such heroism, bravery, kindness, thoughtfulness, whatever it may be? And I see it. Most of the time, we don't live our lives at such dramatic highs or lows. Most of the time, we don't always see why is it godly when I shake the lulav and esrog, whatever it is, each person at their own level, when they can sense their godliness. So at the world of Atzilus, where I'm totally consumed with godliness, I see God even in the Kalim, not just when there is the thunder and lightning. We have the parsha about Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. We ask, what's with all the noise? And isn't godliness about calm and the ways of God are peaceful? Because when you combine the infinite and the finite, you're going to rattle some dishes. There's going to be some shaking going on. So in Atzilus, there's total awareness of Hashem. There is no friction between the infinite and the finite. As we move our way down the worlds, the stages of awareness, the godliness becomes less and less evident. Down here in this physical world, and that's why our mission is, in part, to see the godliness, that is, to at least see that this is art created by the artist. Even if I'm admiring the art, I don't forget that the art is the product of the artist. And to have that awareness and that sensitivity to the artist and not just be consumed with the art. We talked about the spheroids, and again, here are the spheroids that we've laid out, and gave my best opportunity. Now, remember, of course, it should be in Hebrew, so it's right to left. So it goes this way, right to left. So Chachma, Bina, Das. Really, if I was better at it, this Das would be lower. It's more like a triangle than it is a horizontal line. I should have made this a little lower. So these three, which I misspelled imagination, these three, are of intellect. Chachma, imagination, I misspelled it. Bina is the analysis, Das the application. Chesed means limitless. Gevura, restraint. Sorry, I forgot the English there. Tiferes, harmony. Netzach, endurance, which you see this sort of commonality of limitlessness here. Chachma, Chesed, and Netzach are a set. Hod, which is the restraint of self for the glory of others, or Hashem. These are all in that area. And then the middle is all the combo of all of them. Das, Tiferes, harmony, again misspelled. Boy, I got to get my spell check here. And Yesod, the basic sense that I can connect with other people, like charisma. Although I think charisma gets a bad rap. We usually think someone has charisma means they're trying to, mislead you and so on, but not in a bad way. And then we talk less so, but about Keser and Malchus. So Keser means the crown, and Malchus is the character of the king. Now, there's somewhat of a obvious connection between the king, where's the crown. As a general rule, whenever we count Keser, we don't count Malchus, because Keser is the ideal, and Malchus is the implementation of that ideal. So I always use this very simplistic analogy. If the Keser of America is all men are created equal, so the Malchus is everybody has to stop at stop signs. So when you say, well, that's it, stop signs? Meaning, when you look at the stop sign, you don't see the Keser. Like, why is this valuable? Or to use this more spiritualized discussion, the Rebbe often talks about the value of understanding the history of Eretz Yisrael that goes way beyond the political reality of the state of Israel. Because why is a 19-year-old who lives in Tel Aviv find it valuable to risk his life to protect this land that's been around for 70 years? Well, when he understands that it's not just this land that's been a political reality since 1948, but it is the Kesser. This is the objective of the Jewish people, that it's 3,300 years, that it represents every Jew, not just the citizens of Israel. Wow, now he recognizes it. In the pragmatic, we can really only focus on the Malchus. But if we forget the Kesser, if we don't have that kind of reset to recognize the Kesser, we become so consumed with the Malchus that the Kesser gets forgotten. Whereas if we are so fixated on the Kesser, we never have stop signs. We're so consumed with the conceptual, we never get to the practical. So when we count Kesser, there are 10. When we count Malchus, there are 10. We don't count them as 11 except under certain circumstances, and that's why the significance of 11 is it goes out of the routine. Like we know from place value, the number after 10 is 1. Right? 10, and then we add a 1. Then we add a 2, 3, 4. We're always adding 1 as we move along. Okay. The tier 1 is the intellect, the origin.
Rabbi Epstein,
tier 2.
Rabbi Epstein, can you just, sorry, because it's fast and I'm writing on here. So are each of the ones across a triangle? Like Chachma being a
it should be like a downward.
They're a triangle. And then can you just because I wrote restraint under Gevura, but then under Hod, I thought I heard you say restraint again. So can you just
it's a form of restraint, it's glory. Yeah. The word Hod means to give glory. How do I allow someone else to have glory? By holding back, meaning, again, hopefully not, but I can imagine we've all been in that social circumstance with the one person, they have to say every joke, they have to know the answer to every question, they have to choose every topic. They have no Hod. They can't allow someone else to say the answer, someone else to make the joke, someone else to start the conversation. So Hod, ultimately, it's for Hashem. Pardon me. Ultimately, Hod is for Hashem. And if you don't have Hod, then you become the rabbi, because then everyone has to be polite and listen to you. But Hod means I restrain myself to allow somebody else to have glory. Now, again, a distorted form of Hod would be I don't restrain myself because it's all about my glory. But the mechanism to giving glory is to not express myself. Let someone else, like I said, start the conversation.
Thank you so much.
So you got it. So the first line 1 here, and again, we're going right, left, is the intellect, which is the origin. Line 2 is the product. And again, in a holy sense, we think about the infinity of Hashem, we feel it, and then we apply it. And the ultimate tangible application is in the Malchus. So it's not just about being a nice person and committing to niceness and sticking to it. It's about helping the person. It's about doing the action. So again, this is all in the handout. I hope, pardon my misspellings and typos and so on. And we'll talk about these as we go through them. But it's important. I thought it would be helpful if we sort of covered it first, so we don't have to revisit it every time. Okay. So after that, now we can start. So back in the text, this is letter 15. Here we go. Lahavin mashal u'malitza. So again, this is it's a paraphrase of a quote from King Solomon in Proverbs, that our goal is to understand the mashal, which again is the parable, and the malitza, which is the core idea that we hold on to even after we've mastered it. And we don't have to discard it. So the spheroids are not, like I'm calling it simply, they are not simply training wheels that we use. And again, it's like a classic thing. If you want to know that you understand something, try explaining it to somebody who has no idea of the material. Meaning, smart people talk to smart people, and the teacher is a little bit leaning or may lean on the student understanding it from their own intellect. So we're trying to communicate the infinity of Hashem. And again, in Kabbalah, they come up with these terminologies. That's really where the spheroids are discussed, and the structure of the spheroids. And we, in Hasidus, we take that structure and we make them tangible and meaningful, and not just code words. Again, eventually, right, there is a wink, wink, because if we keep digging and digging and digging, Hashem is not any of these, and this is a very important idea. Hashem is not everything. He's not a combination of elements, of attributes. He is innately infinite, and he expresses himself in again, many of the metaphors that we've talked about, like light coming through colored glass. The light isn't really green. It just looks green on this side. So when Hashem expresses himself through Gevura, it looks like Gevura. And this is why many times in the davening, especially like Rosh Hashanah time, we talk about asking Hashem to move from the Gevura seat to the Chesed seat, to express himself not through Gevura, but through Chesed. Okay, here we go. L'havin mashlim it's a divrei chachamim, the words of our scholars, and that's a reference to Kabbalah. And it's curious that we refer to them as chachamim. Chacham meaning, of course, imaginative understanding. It's the infinite imagination. And we're trying to now take that chachma, bina, das, all the way down to something applicable. The chidusam, and chidusam is a curious word. It means like their sharpness. I'm not sure how they translate in the English translations, but it comes from the word chad, which is a point, like the word echod is one. So a point is where two separate ideas come together. So a knife has a chad, a point. So they're referring to their chidosim, like we would say that guy's really sharp. We use a similar term like that in English. But here it's talking about how from that one point, you really have all of this expression, but it all comes from that one. And this is why we're so cautious in Torah and Yiddishkeit and Halacha about only petitioning the infinity of Hashem. We don't petition other entities. We always have to recognize that they are originating in the infinity of Hashem. Be'inyan haspheros, in the idea of the spheros. Now, just even the word spheros is already an insight to this idea. The word spheros is similar to the word of sphera, like spheros ha'omer, to count. It is also the word like sipor, a story. It's also the word sapphire, or like the English sapphire. I don't know a thing about gems, but it's a clarity. So what is the common theme here? We say it in English too. To recount the episode, that is to give a very detailed accounting, again, and we see it, of the story. So counting is not only with numbers. Sfiras ha'omer clearly is numbers. L'saper sipor, to tell a story or to count or recount, is to be very precise. And this is what the spheroids offer us, a mechanism of clarity, of insight into something that is innately amorphous, the infinity of Hashem. Now, again, Hashem has, again, I know it sounds like a silly thing to say. Hashem is so infinite, he must be finite when he doesn't have to be anything. Right. Again, at some point, we run out of words because we're trying to put human terms like a stencil onto an infinite idea. So, right, it works out. If you recall the demonstration we did in Shaykhut Ba'amuna, you have the blank page. We put the stencil on one side of the page. It looks like the letter Aleph. On the origin side, it's just a blank space. So Hashem is that blank space manifest in all of the particulars of his expression. Okay. Moidazos, know ye this, ba'aretz mipi kedoshe elyon nishmasei eden. That this here in the land you can know, that is down here, that it should be personal, practical, applicable, all of that kind of stuff. From these lofty holy people, their neshama is being now in Gan Eden. So again, the Alter Rebbe is not just using the common honorary, like we would say about somebody, Zechrono Levracha or Olav Shalom, but the idea being that their neshamas are in Eden. Now, Eden as you recall, Adam and Chava are created in Eden, and then they are brought into the Garden of Eden. There's Eden, and then there's the Garden of Eden. And the water sources, the four main rivers that flow out of Eden to saturate the world. So there's a certain imagery that's associated with this idea that you have Eden, which becomes the source. So Hashem is the infinite. And then, just like there are the four rivers, there is the multiplicity of expression. My dechsiv, this that it says, and this is a quote from the book of Eov, of Job. We've seen this before, and this is oft quoted in Chassidus. Mipsori echse eloko. The phrase translates as, from my flesh, or from my humanity, I see God. We have a general principle that this pasuk comes to support, that Hashem is desirous of creation, and particularly, of course, human beings, to know him. This is our fundamental, essential truth. So how am I supposed to know Hashem? Well, we begin with something that we know, which is our intuitive awareness of ourselves. Now, we can make the argument that this is true of all of human invention. A very simplistic example. We often talk about the highway system as being remarkably modeled on the circulatory system of the body. Now, we're not here to study biology or transportation, but the conceptual idea that we subconsciously manifest a world that reflects ourselves, because what we are most intuitively aware of is our own identity. Even if I don't know the terms for all of my biological function, I still have an innate awareness. It's kind of one of the beautiful things. You see a small child, they discover their hands, they discover motion, they discover their ability to walk. It's not something that is consciously learned. It's something simply that they see by emulating what they see around them and what is instinctually manifest in their character. Well, we would say, in a sense, that this becomes a lead-in and a model or a portal of entry into our relationship with Hashem. That by understanding ourselves and our function, we start to get a bit of an insight into how Hashem functions. We are created in the image of God. And again, what it ultimately drives is that Hashem wants us to have an innate connection with him. So rather than just thinking that this is modeled after a human being, like, again, we model a robot and we say, well, it has arms. Well, why do we assume it has arms? Because we can't imagine something that's completely outside of our own existence. So we know that we lift packages with arms, so we'll build arms on a robot. It'll lift the packages higher, taller, heavier, and so on. It's still somewhat modeled after our humanity. So sometimes we say, well, that's how we describe Hashem, because we are limited. And there's a truth to that. We have to use terminology that we're familiar with because we're limited beings. And we have to talk about Hashem's arms and said and thought and heart and so on, because we have no other terminology that's going to have any meaning to us. Concurrently, it's not only that we do this, but really it's sort of wrong and it's just childish. It becomes actually true. And this is, again, another one of those points of Chassidus that people were not so down with. That we all recognize that Torah commonly uses this language, the hand of God, the eye of God. Others saw that as totally, I want to say a myth is not a fair word, it's too harsh, but totally just a way of saying it in a childish term because of our inability. And Hashem doesn't have an arm, but we say, no, Hashem does have an arm. Now, we think this is an arm, but that's because of our limited capacity. If we truly understood what an arm was, we would realize that this is just a physical manifestation of an arm. It's not the entirety of an arm. Yes, all the way down in his essence, Hashem is not limited. He's not a combination of parts. But the term hand and arm and thought and so on, we only recognize their malchus illustration. We don't recognize, because of our limitations, their true-on, full-on intensity and capacity. Okay, so the pasuk says, "Mibsari echse elaka," from my flesh I see God. What is this? Shakavanihi. The intent of this is lahovin tzas elokusa yizbare, minefesh hamlubeshes lebasara adam. To a little bit understand, and that's the emphasis. We always have this sort of back and forth where we say, oh, this is what it means. Well, it's not exactly this. But here's an example. Well, we have to play this very precarious balancing act. And Chassidus says, well, we're going to trust you that you're not going to abuse this and think that Hashem really has a five-fingered fleshy thing at the end of his wrist. We're going to accept that. And we're going to recognize that we don't just have a five-fingered fleshy thing, but there's something greater here than simply the movement of our muscles and bones and so forth. And to use that to us to be a little less gashmi and to make Hashem a little more immediate. So we say, from the way the soul is invested in our body, because remember, unlike every other creation that Hashem simply said, let there be whatever, and then there was, when it came to the creation of humanity, Hashem formed the body first from the dust, and then he blew the breath of life into the body. So the soul and the body of a human being are identifiably distinct. In contrast to the soul, because an animal has a soul, a tree, a rock, an angel has a spiritual force, but its spiritual force is not seen as being separate from the physical casing in which it is invested, which is why animals and trees and angels and so forth cannot do any more than simply what their programming is. They can't do less. That's why animals never violate the rules, and they can't do more. That's why they don't wantonly harm, and they don't willfully do kindness. This is in part why the Gemara says that had Torah not given us the mitzvahs, we could have learned basic decency from animals. Modesty from the cat and industriousness from the ant and so on, because they are intuitively programmed for proper behavior, proper etiquette, but not God. Okay. So unlike that, a human being, his soul is invested in his body, as if that they are, not just as if, they are two separate entities. Like the sages say on the pasuk Barchi Nafshi is in Tehillim, chapter 104. And you may also recognize it because we say it on Rosh Chodesh. Barchi Nafshi es Hashem, ma HaKodesh Baruch Hu chulu af Hashem. So one of the lessons that they learn from this is that just like the neshama fills the body, so too Hashem fills the world. Now, the Alter Rebbe is going to list out 5 lessons from this, meaning we say, just like the soul fills the body, Hashem fills the world. So what does that mean? Just like it. Okay, I mean, beyond the fact. So number 1, it fills it. Number 2, it sees, the neshama sees where we're going, but it is unseen. That's why, as you recall from earlier in the Sefer Shalmanin in part of Tanya, in the beginning, the Alter Rebbe often appealed to basic, simple human compassion. Treat your neshama like you treat a guest. Because if you go someplace that your neshama doesn't want to go, it goes with you. So you wouldn't do that. You would, if you had a guest who was allergic to peanuts, you wouldn't serve peanuts. So too, your neshama is allergic to these things. So don't fill your neshama with stuff that your neshama is allergic to. So your neshama sees and is brought along, but it is unseen, like Hashem. The quote from King David, forever God is before me. Right? This idea, Hashem doesn't want to just dwell in the Beis Hamikdash. He wants to dwell b'socham, within them, within every single one of us. It satiates the world and the body. There's no aspect of the body that's not filled with it. It nourishes it. God forbid, if someone is sickly, it starts to manifest itself in the extremities, in their fingertips, whatever it is. And it works back from there. Why? Because the neshama, like health, reaches the most extremes. And this is a common point that we make in Chassidus, that Hashem is the same in the ordinary day as he is on Yom Kippur, in an ordinary place as he is in Eretz Yisrael, in an ordinary person like he is in the Great Tzaddik. It remains pure, like we say every day in the davening, Alakai, Hashgad, Neshama, the soul, Shenasatabi, that you place within me, Tahirihi, it's pure. Even if yesterday I took it places it didn't want to go, my neshama forever remains unsullied. And similarly, Hashem remains unsullied. And ultimately, it dwells in the deepest recesses. It dwells in those areas. And this is a core point that Hasidus makes, that in a sense, there is a greater presence of Hashem, not just also in the ordinary, it's in a sense almost more profoundly there. And that's where we need to focus, meaning that God is in Eretz Yisrael is a little, quote, easier. That God is in my house, that's a little bit more difficult. And therefore, there is a greater gift to see that Hashem is there. That I'm nice to someone on their birthday is wonderful. That I'm nice to them on an ordinary day, or I'm nice to them when I'm irritated or when they are the source of it. Everybody wants to be there when their child does something to be proud of. It's not as easy to be there, and perhaps therefore more meaningful to be there when they're not so well behaved. Okay, so we say and again we revisit a quote from the very beginning, mamash, of the Sefer Shel Beinanim, where the Alter Rebbe quotes this lesson in the Zohar from the description of the creation of man. And again, you recall that unlike everything else that God simply said, "Let there be," and speaking takes much less personal investment, just physically, the amount of breath that a person has to expel in order to speak is pretty minimal, in contrast to this like deep resuscitating kind of CPR form of a deep breath. That is the description of how God creates man. Again, he forms man from dust. You have a lifeless body, and God blows this deep breath within him. And the Zohar explains, again, the pasuk reads, "V'yipach bi'apav," he blew in his nostrils. Nishmas, the soul, we mentioned that word before, chayim, of life. Man denafech metechah nafach. That this word nafach means this exhaustive, tiring, deep breath. Vafilu nefesh ta'asiyah. So even if your soul is a soul from Asiya, now, to back up a moment, you recall that in the very beginning in the Sefer Shel Beinanim, the Alter Rebbe talks about how every Jew has a second soul. That is, we have our innately godly, innately human soul, that we exist, but we exist just like the tree exists or the animals exist. And then Hashem adds this capacity to be godly, not just to be spiritually sensitized, but essentially to get over myself, to not do something simply because of how it works for me. That I keep Shabbos because it brings me relaxation or it brings me centering and so on. But ultimately, Mesiras Nefesh. So the Alter Rebbe makes the point that every Jew, from the most obviously godly tzaddik to the most struggling person who's naturally very desensitized to godliness, the essence of their neshama is absolutely from the infinity of Hashem. And the analogy the Alter Rebbe brings there is that the baby, even the brain, which is the most delicate and most sophisticated aspect of his being, and the fingernails, which we cut and discard, all come from the same origin, the same original space. Now, the Alter Rebbe does there address the source material in the Zohar that says that just like everybody has a character personality, so too everyone has a neshama personality. Meaning, some people are naturally sensitive, some people run fast, they are musical, they're organized. Everybody's got their milas, their distinctive characteristics that are in alliance with their human personality. Well, everybody's got a spiritual personality as well, and that is from the processing of their original essence neshama, like the difference between the brain and the fingernails, that it goes through this whole spiritual gestation, and some neshamas are expressed from the level of Atzilus, and they are thus very naturally aligned with godliness. And some neshamas are dispatched from a world of Asiya, and within Asiya from the spheres. We got into the nuances there. So the Alter Rebbe here is making the point that even if a person says, well, you can't expect this from me. I have a very desensitized neshama. My neshama came off the Asiya um, level, or the Asiya, what's the word I'm looking for? Processing. So it is so thoroughly processed, you can't even recognize its origin. Like the difference between, to use a very silly food analogy, you take a baked potato, you see it came from the potato, but then you find out that there's some potato flakes and some other thing. You can't even imagine it. I know it's a silly analogy, forgot with something better, but you get the concept. So even if I say, well, my neshama is so crass, my neshama is so desensitized, still, hibo mizivuk zun. It still is the product of the union of zun. So you remember, hopefully, back on the vocabulary word page, the combination of the 6 internal midos matched up with malchus, which spits out like a factory this neshama. So even if I got the most crass neshama, it comes. I'll give you just an example that comes to mind. In the story of the procession of how the tribes marched. So the tribe that was at the bottom, the last tribe, was the tribe of Dan. And their job was to basically pick up the lost and found. So this is commonly referred to as, sort of like a very lowly job. And then they talk about why Dan was burdened with this position. So of course, Hasidus comes along and says, it's better that. And the Rebbe points out, I don't know if it's originally, but that's where I saw it, maybe it's from earlier sources, that this is the level of dawn, that things that other people looked past, meaning they couldn't see the Kedusha, you needed to have dawn come to discover the Kedusha in things that other people walked past. Why did those people leave those things behind? Not just because they forgot or they were rushed or they littered, because they couldn't appreciate the Kedusha that was there and dawn could. Which, of course, is a very beautiful thing to say about Dan. And it's also a very demanding thing because, again, we've talked about this many times before. When the Baal Shem Tov came along and said that even the simple person can serve Hashem, some of the scholars were not so happy with that. And some of the simple people, well, what do you mean? Expect me to do this? This is for holy people. Me? Right? So, right? I'm done. You know what, Rabbi? I'm not so spiritual. And my neshama, too, it doesn't matter. You have to learn Torah, daven, do mitzvahs, and so on and so forth. And you don't get to say, well, and it may be true, right? But I'm dumb. Right? You are stupid and crass and foolish and so on, but you still have to do it. Again, so this is that level. That every level of zun, again, the combination of the 6 with the malchus expression, is still from the kelim. Remember that word there as well, the vessels that come from, even if it's the most shallow aspect of Atzilus. Remember, in Atzilus, you see godliness in the kelim, in the activities, in the vessels. Just like you look at the Torah and you see it comes from God. You look at a great act of kindness and selflessness and you see that it comes from God. This is what the awareness and alertness is for everything in Atzilus. And that's the origin point from way back when. So even if you didn't go to yeshiva, and even if you're not naturally a very spiritualized person, and even if you don't enjoy the mitzvahs and so on, you have that neshama that comes from that origin, shehem elikus mamish, which is mamish godliness. Even if you don't feel that way, and again, what presents as humility could sometimes just be laziness or an excuse. You don't expect me to do this. This is for holy people, not for me. That in case within it, and again, we can point to so many examples of people who, again, present themselves as quote unquote spiritually detached, desensitized, and then their neshama comes alive. Why? And again, one of the great examples, as the Rebbe points out, you know that it's true because even though they don't do anything Jewish, if you were to suggest evilly, wrong, that they're not Jewish, they'd become very defensive. Why are you so defensive? Because he is Jewish, and he's as Jewish as the tzaddik, and he has that same godly soul. And so, you think because I don't do, therefore, what are you getting so defensive about? Because it is true of your basic core identity. Okay. Hamalubish begonus b'chachma datzilis. Diu begamu chad batzilis. And again, this innate godliness, where is it contained? In the neshama. And as we said, neshama is the distinctive human quality for chachma. Again, not chachma that I'm the smartest guy or that I know 100 pages of the Talmud, but chachma in the sense of my capacity to imagine outside of myself. And in Atzilus, the Iuv Chad Batzilus, that in Atzilus, everything is evidently godly, even when you can give it some sort of descriptive. And that's contained within every person, even the person who says, but it wasn't meaningful to me, and I don't find it a connection and didn't inspire me. Therefore, also in the neshama of every person. And again, Adam, we always talk about, is the Aleph, the oneness of God, that rules over the biological function indicated by the word dam, which translates as blood, but is a representative for all biological imperative. Meir Orein Seif Baruch Hu, the infinite light of Hashem, radiates within that person, even if he says no, but not, as we said. Begonus Bara Chachma. How do you uncover it? Where do you discover it? You discover it in Chachma. Now, Chachma, again, if we thought that Chachma was only about skilled capacity, so, well, I'm not that smart. And that's true. There are people who are just not that smart. But Chachma is about the willingness. It's more about character than it is about data. It's about the willingness to get beyond myself. That's what gives this person life, that he is driven by this capacity. And this gives him at least somewhat of an entry point into becoming connected with, and thus being able to have a relationship with, it's kind of a broad term, but with the spheros. Because all of those spheros do exist within him. So it's actually the parsha we read yesterday, the origin that teaches us that we put tefillin on our weak hand. I mean, why does a right-handed person put tefillin on the left hand? Even though we tend to always do things with our strongest hand. So we could have seemingly put the tefillin on our right hand. So we explain because it teaches us that we must serve Hashem with our weaknesses, not just with our strengths. We don't get to say, well, I don't do that. I only study Torah, I don't daven, I only daven, I don't do social activities, and so on. I do Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur, not Sukkot. Why? Because the infinity of Hashem exists within every aspect of our identity. It penetrates throughout our existence. And therefore, it's accessible to us, even if I feel like, well, you don't expect me to do this. Yeah, we do. Okay, we'll stop here. Continue next Avach.